All right, so 8.1b, social dynamics of the Industrial Revolution. I think my podcast thing will not work if I go over 15 minutes here. So we got a lot to cover in this section, but how's the Industrial Revolution impact gender, family roles, blah, 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 all these things. And we're going to go ahead and get into that and not waste time. So, first of all, here's the deal. Under the cottage industry, people worked at home. And you worked with your families, which means that when you're working and when you're living, you're with your families both times. So you really don't ever say bye to your family, which for some of you is a terrifying prospect. But good news, when the Industrial Revolution starts, people then start to go out of the home for work, school, whatever. So as factories are built, now we go work in different places, and at first families work together. So the family unit was still together during the day, and then you go home at night and you're still together. But when factories decided to pay more for men usually that could do a certain skill, maybe they're a blacksmith or whatever that skill might be, they became more valuable in the job market and they were paid more. Therefore, their work often would be separated from the other parts of the family, which meant that the, let's say, women, children, unskilled, certainly on both instances, would have a different role in the factory than, say, their skilled husband, father, whatever. Okay, so now we start to see a little bit of separation in the workplace, and it breaks up that family unit. Big thing. Then, at home, you start to see a little bit of difference in terms of gender roles. Now, the whole, understanding of, the married woman does this, and that is born here primarily in the Industrial Revolution. Before, single woman, married woman, you work on the farms, you're doing the same thing. But now what we see is that if you're married, usually if your husband has a skilled job, that's enough money to take care of the family. You're going to be home with the young children. And when the children get a little bit older, maybe you go back to work. But now you can afford to stay home because the man has a profitable enough job. Well, guess what? If you're a single woman, you don't have that luxury. You got to work to stay on your feet. And most single women are unskilled workers, which means they're going to be taking very low-wage jobs which pay very little and have very little collateral against the employer, meaning that the employer can get rid of the woman or the worker whenever he wants. So it's very much not a good situation. And that's why kind of the illusion of, hey, I need to get married to improve my standing, that was definitely something that was developing. And here's a picture of some lovely women working. I have no idea what they're doing, but I'm sure they're doing a good job. They look very happy to be alive. Take a look at the working conditions, though. I mean, we got exposure to open air. Certainly they're standing. There's no chairs for them to sit in while working. Heads are probably going, and necks are going to be pointed down all day as they work. Certainly, working conditions, not a premium during the Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about that more and look at some more sources that describes that, but you see these women here not having a great time. Okay, one of the other things you see is that class becomes such a bigger deal in Europe, even more so than it had been. Now, we looked at our traditional social pyramid, the social class pyramid, where you have the nobles and clergy up top. Clergy and nobility in terms of social power are now going to be largely irrelevant, especially the clergy in terms of social political power. The nobility now, even them in some places, cease to exist and really don't have much of a role. What you have now, especially in Western Europe, is the rise of the upper bourgeoisie. The ones with money who, in fact, start to impersonate some of the nobility. They start dressing very nice. They start having fancy parties and doing things like that because they are the ones that are the movers and shakers. You also have a group called the petite bourgeoisie, who are the small industrious professional men. These usually are very skilled workers or skilled small, let's say like small business owners, something like that, teachers, lawyers. We'll see the growth of this class even more so in the second Industrial Revolution coming up down the road. But that's something to track as we go forward. The bourgeoisie, again, growing and growing in power, numbers, and significance. And then we have what we're going to start calling the proletariat. These are the rabble-rousing masses of people who have no lot in life except to work and work some more. They earn a daily wage. They do what they can to support their families. It's just really a kind of a crappy situation for all of them. They live in poor housing. Many of them are displaced agricultural peasants. They work in poor conditions. It's really a sucky thing. So the difference between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, this is language we need to know because the Industrial Revolution has created this divide. There's not as much subtlety inside of, let's say, the economic diversity now between the rich and the poor. Now it's basically you bourgeoisie or you proletariat. Now inside of those groups, you're going to have a lot of different groups. But overall, you can sort it just into, hey, here's the ones who have and here's the ones who don't have. And this is a nice cartoon. This machinery is very productive and I own it. That's why I'm rich. But you didn't build this machinery and you don't operate it. In fact, you don't seem to do any work around here. I don't know. I'm sorry with the voices. But it's kind of the general point is, I have, you don't. I own, you don't. You do the work for me. That kind of thing. I love this graphic. We'll look at this, I think, in class. Take a look at it there. Look who's doing the work and look who's profiting. I mean, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting discussion to have. And maybe the parallels to our society. Briefly, kind of the differences in the tension between labor, the workers, and capital, the ones who have. You do have the growth of unions, which have been outlawed in some cases, but now they're back, and unions, of course, fight for the working conditions of the workers. You have the Chartist movement that is in England. It's a movement in Parliament to give political rights to the working class. If you remember what kinds of people make up Parliament, that should tell you how successful this group was. And then you have a group called the Luddites, which tried to destroy, basically property damage, destroy machinery because they feared that the mechanization of work would take jobs away from the people, and they were exactly right. That trend does start to happen, and it is happening in our world. The Luddites, that word actually comes into our vernacular today because it describes somebody who kind of resists technology. If you know that person, maybe your uncle, grandfather, or whatever, who's like, I'm not getting one of those darn phones. Like, okay, buddy. Good for you. And just as a wrap up here, kind of an evaluation of the Industrial Revolution. Long term, you could say, if you want to be subjective, it is a good thing. We're going to look at a lot of the negative evidence. I think that's just, with the historical movement, you want to look at the negative of it and then consider also the positive. There's going to be a lot of new, cheaper made goods for people to use. And of course, if there's a lot of supply because these machines can make it so quickly, shirts, for example, it's going to be cheap. Wages go up and are consistent. They are not dependent on agricultural seasons as they were before. And then the governments, we're going to talk about this next unit. Governments start to intervene on the rights of workers. You'll have something called the Factory Act, which your reading talks about. The Factory Act in England, which protects the rights of workers to work limited hours and not just at the whim of the bosses. So it's a huge deal, what you start to see. Negatives, the housing is poor. We saw that in the last podcast. The workers don't share in the massive wealth produced. Income inequality starts to grow and still grows and keeps growing, and that's the story of social dynamics of the Industrial Revolution. More to come later.